When I moved into Evergreen Glen, I thought I'd finally found calm. The lawns looked as if someone had measured them with a ruler, and mailboxes stood in perfect rows. Every evening, porch lights flickered on in unison like the neighborhood was programmed for order. After years of noise and city clutter, the silence felt almost sacred. I unpacked slowly, filling the house one quiet room at a time until it began to feel like mine. Then came Max, a border collie mix I adopted from the shelter after one look into his amber eyes. His tail seemed powered by its own engine, full of unfiltered joy. From the moment he padded across the floor, the house felt alive. For a while, life was simple. Mornings were coffee and code. Afternoons were walks through the calm streets of Evergreen Glen, Max trotting ahead like he belonged here more than I did. The neighbors smiled politely, trimming their hedges in perfect synchronization. I mistook it for harmony. The illusion of peace shattered the morning Janet Kent appeared at the edge of my driveway. She stood perfectly still, a pastel blazer pressed to perfection, clipboard balanced like a weapon, her hair sculpted into a shape that defied both wind and reason. Even from a distance, her presence carried the sharpness of authority disguised as hospitality. She offered a practiced smile, the kind that doesn't invite warmth but demands obedience. I'd met her type before, people who mistake control for order, who measure harmony by how well others comply. Max barked once from behind the screen door, low and steady, as if confirming what I already sensed. Her questions were coded in politeness, but every word carried weight, testing boundaries I hadn't realized existed. When she finally turned and walked away, the rhythm of her heels lingered like a ticking clock. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the sound of being watched in Evergreen Glen. For weeks, Evergreen Glen looked like peace itself. Rows of matching houses, trimmed lawns, quiet evenings broken only by the rhythm of sprinklers. But peace in places like this is fragile, built on routine and control. The first fracture appeared the morning I found a folded envelope wedged beneath my welcome mat. Its neat print read, "Notice of violation, pet non-compliance." It claimed my dog Max exceeded the approved weight for residential pets. I reread the line confused. There was no such rule in the HOA handbook I'd studied before buying this house. I checked again. Nothing. Still, the paper trembled in my hand, not because of fear, but because I recognized the tone. It wasn't about dogs or regulations. It was about power. Outside, the air seemed heavier, as if the whole street was holding its breath, waiting for my reaction. Max nudged my leg, tail wagging gently, unaware he had just become the reason for someone's next obsession. That day, I learned the first rule of Evergreen Glen. Silence keeps the peace, but only until someone decides it doesn't. A week later, another notice appeared, then another, and another. Each one more absurd than the last. Noise disturbance, improper waste bin placement, porch decor not in aesthetic harmony. The language was polite, the intent venomous. Janet Kent had declared war behind the mask of civility. I tried reason first. I sent detailed emails with photos and bylaw references. No reply. Only an automated acknowledgement that my concerns had been received. It was bureaucracy as a weapon. One evening, through the blinds, I caught her standing at the end of my driveway, talking into her phone, gesturing toward my porch as if delivering a report. Max's low growl echoed through the quiet. I realized then that she wasn't enforcing the rules. She was writing them as she went. Her power depended on fear and compliance, and both were running out. I turned off the lights, sat by the window, and watched her fade back into the shadows of Evergreen Glen, a silhouette of authority sustained by silence. Mine had just ended. There comes a moment when inconvenience becomes intrusion, when small irritations cross the invisible line between nuisance and threat. For me, it happened on an ordinary Thursday morning, wrapped in the quiet routine of coffee, emails, and the low hum of my computer. The first sign was the delivery. A small package I'd been expecting, replacement filters for my air purifier. The tracking showed it had been successfully received. But when I checked the porch, the space was empty. Clean. Too clean. The absence itself felt deliberate. I checked the footage from my door camera. There, in the frame, was Janet, stepping onto my porch in the late afternoon, glancing both ways before bending down to take the package. The timestamp was precise. Her movements were careful, practiced, as if she had done it before. Watching it, I didn't feel anger at first, just a cold recognition, the understanding that subtlety was no longer enough for her. Control was an addiction, and she had relapsed. I saved the footage, labeled it Property Interference 01, and added it to the growing archive. That week, things escalated quickly. My internet cut out twice, always during work hours. Maintenance confirmed it was tampering. The cable had been disconnected manually near the street junction. Someone had to know exactly where to look. The next day, a new letter appeared on my door, folded neatly under a magnetic clip. It bore the HOA logo, but not the usual formatting. The tone was harsher, colder. It warned of potential fines for behavioral, non-compliance, and disruptive use of external surveillance equipment. The irony didn't escape me, and the woman who monitored everyone's lives was now offended that I had started watching back. For a few hours, I considered ignoring it as I had before, but something inside me shifted. There's a particular kind of calm that comes when fear gives way to calculation, a stillness sharper than anger. I realized I wasn't reacting anymore. I was observing. I wasn't the target now. I was the witness. That night, I sat in front of my computer and began compiling a report. Each entry had a timestamp, cross-referenced with footage, emails, and correspondence. I formatted it like a case file, clean, chronological, undeniable. I had built similar systems for clients before, tracking software anomalies and access violations. This was no different, only the malfunctioning code was human. By the time the clock reached midnight, the file was 47 pages long. I titled it, Evergreen Glen HOA, Abuse of Authority, Preliminary Documentation. When I finally shut down the computer, the house was completely still. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful. Identical lights glowing in identical windows, identical lives ticking forward under the illusion of order. But beneath that stillness, something had cracked. It wasn't just about packages or notices anymore. It was about boundaries, the invisible kind that define decency. Janet had crossed hers long ago, and now I was ready to show what happens when evidence starts to speak louder than control. I stopped thinking of it as conflict and started treating it like design. Every system, no matter how chaotic, has patterns, and Janet was nothing if not consistent. She operated in cycles: provocation, retreat, observation, repeat. It was almost mathematical, and that made her predictable. Predictability is a weakness when facing someone who plans. I spent the next few days quietly preparing. Cameras were repositioned, not to confront but to record from new angles, higher, narrower, less visible. Motion lights were recalibrated to respond to body heat instead of sound. Every step was deliberate, tested, verified. The house became an instrument of quiet observation, each sensor tuned to capture the moment truth would reveal itself. Then came the setup. I ordered several small deliveries, staggered over different days' packages labeled with unimportant names, low-value items no one would risk stealing for gain. It wasn't about loss. It was about confirmation. The first two arrived safely. The third vanished within an hour of delivery. When I checked the footage that night, the pattern unfolded with the precision of déjà vu. Same hour, same deliberate posture. Janet's shadow crossing the porch like a rehearsed movement, the quick glance toward the street. The calculated hesitation before her hand closed around something that didn't belong to her. It wasn't just theft. It was a ritual, a performance she couldn't resist. Proof that control had consumed her so completely that she no longer understood boundaries. I saved the recording, extracted still frames, and cross-referenced the timestamps with HOA meeting emails, that conveniently placed her at home during each incident. The alignment was perfect, like watching two lines of code converge into an error message. By the end of the week, I had enough material to turn suspicion into evidence. Each clip was named, numbered, archived. I created 3 encrypted backups, one on the cloud, one on a drive stored off-site, and one hidden inside a folder disguised as tax records. Years of cybersecurity work had taught me one rule: the more fragile the truth, the better it must be protected. What fascinated me most wasn't the evidence itself, but the psychology behind it. Janet wasn't stealing for gain. She was stealing for proof of control. The stolen objects were tokens of dominance. Her way of reminding the world that nothing, not even someone else's front porch, existed beyond her reach. I could have confronted her then, but confrontation feeds power. Exposure, however, erases it. The plan formed naturally, not revenge, not even justice, just inevitability. All it required was one final act, one moment when she'd pushed too far in full view of something she couldn't silence. I didn't know when it would happen, but I knew it would. Silence has always been my favorite weapon. People fear it more than confrontation because silence forces them to hear themselves. Janet thrived on reaction, on making others flinch, argue, or comply. I decided to starve her of that satisfaction. My stillness became a strategy. I didn't shout. I didn't complain. I simply watched. I began recording everything: times, patterns, angles of approach. She was predictable in the way only obsessive people can be. Every morning she made the same slow patrol around the cul-de-sac, pretending to check flower beds while her eyes traced my house. Sometimes she'd stop near my gate, pretending to read her phone while actually studying my porch. Control was her ritual, and rituals always repeat. So I built my system: cameras hidden beneath the eaves, sensors under the mailbox, motion alerts linked to my phone. Each time she crept near, the screen lit up with her silhouette. Max would lift his head, ears twitching, but never bark. He seemed to understand that we were hunting for patience, not noise. By the 4th week, I had enough data to predict her behavior. I created a fake delivery, a decoy box placed neatly by my door just after sunset. Inside was nothing but air and a folded note. Then I waited. Through the grainy feed of the camera, I watched her appear from the shadows. Her posture was cautious but certain, like a thief who believed herself invisible. She scanned for witnesses, adjusted her scarf, and bent down to inspect the box. When she reached for it, the motion sensor triggered a soft chime. She froze, turned, looked around, and, believing she'd escaped, carried the box halfway down the path. I watched her stop suddenly, open it, and stare at the message inside. Some rules can't be invented. She stood motionless for several seconds, then quickly placed the note back and retreated into the dark. I didn't smile. I just watched the playback again and again. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was confirmation. The predator finally knew she was being observed. After that night, Janet changed. The neighborhood queen began moving like a shadow in her own kingdom. Her morning patrols became shorter, her gaze sharper yet uncertain. She greeted no one, spoke less, and glanced over her shoulder more often than forward. Fear had entered her system, and once fear settles in, it rewrites everything. I didn't provoke her. I didn't have to. My plan was already unfolding quietly, one record at a time. Every file, every clip, every screenshot found its place in a neat folder labeled documentation. What began as self-defense was turning into evidence. The irony was almost poetic. The woman obsessed with order would fall to the weight of my precision. Neighbors began whispering. I overheard fragments during walks with Max. Stories about her past fines, absurd rules, and quiet vendettas. Everyone had one. A mailbox repainted twice because the color was too expressive. A tree cut down because it obstructed symmetry, yet no one ever challenged her. Until now, a week later, the next envelope arrived. This one claimed I had created false security alerts and imposed a fine for disrupting community harmony. Her signature gleamed at the bottom, confident and careless. That was her mistake. Arrogance always leaves fingerprints. I placed the letter at the top of my folder, the final piece of her own undoing. That night, I barely slept. The air felt heavier than usual, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Max lay near the window, his eyes half open, as if waiting too. I knew what tomorrow would bring. In the morning, I would walk into the HOA office, not to argue, but to end this. With paper, not emotion. With structure, not noise. Morning arrived without ceremony. The air was sharp and clear, carrying the scent of wet pavement and early grass. I dressed deliberately. Neutral colors, hair tied back, folder in hand. Max watched me from the doorway, head tilted, sensing the weight of intention. When I stepped outside, he gave a single soft bark, as if to wish me luck. The HOA office was a converted bungalow on the edge of the neighborhood, tidy from the outside and claustrophobic within. The walls were lined with neatly framed rules and smiling photos of board members at community picnics, a museum of pretend harmony. Behind the front desk sat Harold, the mild-mannered treasurer who had perfected the art of avoidance. His eyes widened when he saw my folder. I didn't waste words. I placed it on the counter, unlatched the clasp, and spread the contents. Timestamps, camera stills, violation letters, digital correspondence, even the forged fine notice. He hesitated before touching the papers, like they might burn. "This is every instance of misconduct I've documented over the past 2 months," I said simply. "Harassment, forgery, unauthorized fines, property interference." He nodded slowly, flipping through the pages. The silence stretched. Outside, I could hear the distant rhythm of sprinklers and the hum of traffic, the sounds of a community unaware that its foundation had begun to crack. When he reached the final page, he let out a quiet breath. "You've done my job for me," he murmured, not quite meeting my eyes. I didn't reply. I didn't need approval, only acknowledgement. He promised to forward everything to the property management company and schedule an emergency board meeting. His tone was professional, but his hands shook slightly when he handed me the receipt. He knew what this meant. Walking home, I felt something new. Not triumph, not relief, but clarity. Control built on intimidation had an expiration date, and Janet's was near. That night, I reviewed my files one last time. The data told a perfect story: cause, effect, consequence. Max curled beside me, content, unaware that his quiet companionship had been my anchor through the storm. I closed the laptop and whispered to the empty room. Now it's her turn to answer. The HOA meeting was announced 2 days later. A printed notice appeared on every mailbox. Emergency session, attendance encouraged. The wording was sterile, but the air around the neighborhood vibrated with curiosity. People love order, but they love spectacle more. The community center was packed that evening, folding chairs filled, murmurs bouncing off beige walls. I sat near the back, my folder on my lap. Janet entered last, immaculate as ever. White blazer, pearls, hair sculpted into obedience. She scanned the crowd with the calm of a performer convinced she still owned the stage. Harold began with formality, reading from printed notes. His voice trembled as he summarized the complaint and listed the exhibits I'd submitted. The room shifted. Neighbors leaned forward, recognizing pieces of their own experiences in his words. Fines they'd paid, warnings they'd endured, the weight of her rules. When he finished, he opened the floor. I stood not to speak, but to act. I set my tablet on the podium and pressed play. The footage filled the wall. Janet sneaking across my porch at dusk, lifting the decoy box, opening it under the streetlight. Her expression when she read the note, a flicker of guilt, confusion, and rage, froze the room. No one spoke. Even Janet's mask faltered for the first time in years. She tried to compose herself, but her hands betrayed her, trembling as she reached for her papers. Her voice, usually crisp and commanding, broke when she attempted to deflect. "Taken out of context," she muttered. But context was irrelevant when truth played in high definition. The board voted immediately, suspension pending investigation. Harold avoided her eyes as he read the decision aloud. For the first time since I'd moved in, the room didn't orbit around her. When it was over, I stepped outside. The air was cool, the night sky wide and clean. I didn't feel victorious, just steady. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't need to announce itself. It settles, quiet and precise, like balance restored. At home, Max met me at the door, tail wagging gently. I sat beside him, hand resting on his fur, the hum of the neighborhood soft in the distance. For the first time in months, the silence outside wasn't tense. It was peace, the kind you earn. The following week was quieter than I had ever known it. The same neighbors who once looked away now waved when I passed by. Their smiles were hesitant at first, the kind people wear when freedom feels new. I didn't hold it against them. Fear is contagious, but so is relief. Word spread quickly. The management company confirmed an official audit of all HOA correspondence and expenses. The findings weren't surprising: misused funds, falsified signatures, and fabricated violations. Each discovery was another brick falling from the illusion Janet had built. The headlines were local, brief, almost mundane. HOA president under investigation for fraud and harassment. To outsiders, it was another story about petty suburban politics. To us, it was the end of an era. I watched from a distance as the process unfolded. Investigators came and went. Boxes of files left the office. Her once perfect yard grew slightly uneven, her mailbox unpolished, her curtains drawn. The symmetry she'd forced on everyone else began collapsing around her. Control, it seemed, had always been the only thing holding her upright. I didn't attend the next board election, though I was invited to run. I didn't need authority. I already had peace. Instead, I spent that morning on the porch, coffee steaming in my hands, while Max chased shadows along the fence. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. One afternoon, a letter arrived. No signature, no header, and just a handwritten apology. The ink was neat, deliberate, and unmistakably hers. It said little beyond acknowledgement. You were right. I went too far. I folded it once and tucked it into the same folder that had once held all my evidence. Proof of conflict and proof of closure, stored together because they belong to the same story. Peace doesn't always arrive with forgiveness. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a system finally returning to equilibrium. Months later, the neighborhood looked almost ordinary again. New flowers bloomed where fences had been overpainted. Children played chalk games on the sidewalks she once patrolled. The air felt lighter, no longer measured by her approval. Order had survived, but this time it belonged to everyone. I still check my cameras sometimes, out of habit, though the screens now show nothing but sunlight and the occasional bird. The sensors blink green, normal, steady, calm. Sometimes neighbors still mention her name, cautiously, as if invoking a ghost. I just smile and change the subject. I have no desire for revenge or retelling. The story has already told itself. Every morning, Max sits beside me on the porch, head tilted toward the same rising sun that once cast her shadow across my yard. Light fills the house easily now, unguarded and clean. I've learned something vital, that control collapses when met with clarity. And that silence, when paired with truth, is the sharpest form of justice. In the end, the neighborhood didn't just regain its calm. It rediscovered what peace really sounds like, the sound of nothing being taken from you anymore.